Leday is the runner at second, and there's a shot into the corner. He won't get around the walk. Scoring easily is Leday. It's a 2-2 game here in the seventh. The Yankees once again patient as cobras and striking like one.
We're here to do a job of playing baseball, and you know, for the fans that have come and paid to get in the park, you know, they deserve something, and you know, I think that's what I'm going to do from now on is try to just sign when I'm in uniform.
The tragic truth about Chuck Knoblauch is that he was supposed to be one of the greatest second basemen who ever played the game. That was not a stretch. That was not hype. That was the honest, reasonable expectation that baseball had for this man. And for a long time, he was delivering on every single part of it. 4 All-Star games, a Gold Glove, a World Series ring in his very first season in the majors, batting averages that climbed deep into the 340s during his prime, a stolen base record that still stands in Minnesota to this day. I am Mason, and this is Baseball Icon.
He was not just good. He was the kind of player that makes scouts look like geniuses, that makes fans fall completely in love with a franchise, that makes an organization feel like the future is bright and already taken care of. He was polished, smart, fundamentally excellent, and he was going to be great for a long time. And then, in one of the strangest, most heartbreaking, most public unravelings that professional sports has ever witnessed, it all fell apart. Not slowly, not quietly, not behind closed doors. It fell apart in front of millions of people on the biggest stage in baseball, in the most watched and most ruthless media market in all of America. Chuck Knoblauch lost the ability to throw a baseball to first base, a throw he had made automatically 10,000 times, a throw that should have been muscle memory so deep it required no thought at all. And what came after that collapse was, if anything, even worse. If you have never heard the full story, the real story from the very beginning all the way to the bitter end, then you are in exactly the right place. And if you enjoy stories like this, where the real tragic truth behind a famous name turns out to be darker and stranger than anything you could have imagined, go ahead and hit the hype button right now and give this video some hype so that more baseball fans find their way here and get to hear it. Before we get into the collapse, we need to spend some time understanding exactly what was lost, because you cannot feel the full weight of this fall unless you truly understand the height from which he fell. And we need to start not at the beginning of his career, but closer to the end. Not the end of his playing days, but the final door that closed on him completely and for good. It was the summer of 2014. The Minnesota Twins had done something that nobody was expecting, and that took a certain amount of generosity. They had voted Chuck Knoblauch into the Twins Hall of Fame. Let that sit for a moment. After everything that had happened between Knoblauch and that franchise, after the bitterness of his trade demand back in 1997, after the years of hostility from Minnesota fans whenever he returned to the Metrodome, after the very ugly way that chapter had ended, the organization decided to step back from all of that and honor the player he had been. It was a recognition of real things. The 1991 World Series championship, the stolen base records, the years of disciplined, elite baseball he had given to a small market team that genuinely needed him. The induction was scheduled. The ceremony was planned. It was supposed to be a moment of closure, and then came the arrest. His ex-wife, Sherry, alleged that Knoblauch had assaulted her by slamming her head into a wall and throwing a humidifier at her. He was taken into custody on July 24th, 2014. The Twins canceled the induction immediately. No rescheduling. The ceremony was gone. The recognition was gone. And the door that had briefly opened back toward baseball shut in his face with a finality that was impossible to misread. That was the final word from the sport that had once celebrated this man as a Rookie of the Year, a World Series champion, and a future Hall of Famer. It was not a quiet exit, it was a complete severance. And to understand how a man gets from Rookie of the Year and World Series champion to that moment in 2014, you have to go all the way back to the beginning. Chuck Knoblauch was drafted 25th overall by the Minnesota Twins in the first round of the 1989 MLB draft. He was a second baseman with quick and reliable hands, sharp baseball instincts, and a mind for the game that scouts noted immediately. He did not spend years grinding in the minors. He came up ready and proved it fast. In 1991, his very first full season in the major leagues, he won the American League Rookie of the Year award. A World Series ring came with it that same year. He was not just a statistics-driven player either. He was a thinker on the field, a player who understood the game at a level beyond the physical and used it against opponents. During Game 7 of the 1991 World Series against the Atlanta Braves, with the championship on the line, Knoblauch pulled off one of the smartest individual plays you will ever see a second baseman execute in a pressure situation. When Terry Pendleton hit a double double, Knoblauch faked the motion of starting a double play, selling it completely. Atlanta base runner Lonnie Smith bought the fake. He hesitated. He slowed his feet when he should have been running full speed. And because of that moment of hesitation, he could not score from first base on a hit that should have easily plated a run. The Twins held on and won Game 7. Knoblauch did not homer. He did not make a diving catch. He used his brain to deceive a runner at a critical moment in the most important game of the year. That was who he was. That was the kind of player the Twins had developed. Over the next 6 years in Minnesota, he built one of the most complete offensive profiles of any second baseman in the American League. He hit .312 in 1994, then .333 in 1995, then .341 in 1996. Those are exceptional numbers for anyone, but for a second baseman posting an on-base percentage around .390 while stealing bases at an elite level, they were remarkable. He stole more than 40 bases in 3 consecutive seasons from 1995 through 1997. He finished his time in Minnesota holding the franchise career stolen base record at 276. He was named to 4 All-Star games. He won the American League Gold Glove at second base in 1997, the award given specifically to the best defensive player at that position in the league. ESPN personalities gave him a nickname that was more compliment than clever. They called him fundamentally sound. Not flashy, not imaginative, but in baseball terms, calling a player fundamentally sound is like calling a surgeon precise. It means he does everything correctly. It means he can be trusted without reservation. It means the game comes naturally to him in a way it does not come to most players, even professional ones who have been working at it their entire lives. But underneath that image of reliability and excellence, something was beginning to shift in ways that would matter enormously. The Twins were struggling. They were a small market team operating inside financial constraints that were becoming impossible to ignore as the league's richer franchises spent freely and built deeper rosters. Knoblauch had signed a 5-year, $30 million contract in 1996, and as that deal neared its end, it was becoming clear that Minnesota could not build a genuine contender around him the way he believed they should. Late in the 1997 campaign, with the Twins finishing well under 500, Knoblauch made a decision that would permanently alter his relationship with Minnesota fans. He publicly asked to be traded. In the context of modern professional baseball, a player requesting a trade is fairly common. Athletes are professionals. They seek out winning situations. But in Minnesota, in 1997, with a fan base that had invested deeply in this player and watched him grow from a rookie into one of the finest players in franchise history, the trade request felt like something much more personal than a business decision. He had not been traded against his will. He had chosen to leave. He had looked at the fans and the organization that had built him into a star and decided it was not enough. Minnesota did not forget it. On February 6, 1998, the trade was completed. The Twins sent Knoblauch to the New York Yankees in exchange for pitcher Eric Milton, infielder Christian Guzman, outfielder Brian Buchanan, pitcher Danny Mota, and $3 million in cash. New York had given up legitimate prospects and real money. The expectations attached to Knoblauch on his arrival in the Bronx were going to reflect that investment. The hostility back in Minnesota did not stay quiet or theoretical. When Knoblauch returned to the Metrodome as a visiting player, he found out exactly how the fan base felt about his departure. In a particularly ugly 2001 incident, spectators threw hot dogs, beer bottles, quarters, and golf balls at him on the field. It was not scattered throwing from a few angry fans. It was sustained enough that the game had to be delayed twice, and the Twins organization was nearly forced to forfeit the contest. A Gold Glove second baseman, a man who had given 7 years of excellent baseball to that city, was being pelted with objects by the people who used to cheer his name. That image tells you something important about the depth of the betrayal they felt. When Knoblauch arrived in New York, the coverage was immediate and the predictions were enormous. Sports writers declared that Knoblauch and shortstop Derek Jeter were about to form the greatest double play combination in the history of baseball. That is exactly the kind of bold, sweeping statement that the New York media loves to make when things are going well, but it was not entirely without foundation. These were two elite players at the top of their games arriving in the same infield at the same time, surrounded by one of the most talented rosters ever assembled. The Yankees were already a powerhouse. Adding a Gold Glove second baseman with elite on-base skills and 40 steal speed felt like fitting in the final piece of a puzzle that was already mostly complete. And at first, everything went exactly according to that optimistic vision. In 1998, the New York Yankees won 114 games in the regular season. It stands as one of the greatest single-season performances in the history of professional baseball. Knoblauch was part of that machine, hitting a career-high 17 home runs, getting on base at an elite clip, and playing his role in what would become a dominant World Series run. That was the first ring. Then came 1999, and they won again, with Knoblauch delivering a game-tying 2-run home run in Game 3 of the World Series. Then 2000, a third straight championship. And even in 2001, when the dynasty was beginning to crack at the edges, Knoblauch was still there, still contributing, scoring the winning run in Game 5 of the World Series. 3 championships in his first 3 years in pinstripes. By any measure, that was a successful incredible tenure. The offensive contributions were real, and the rings were earned. But something else was happening alongside all of that championship success, and it was not subtle if you knew where to look. There was a moment in Game 2 of the 1998 American League Championship Series against Cleveland that most people filed away as a strange one-off and quickly forgot. After a bunt play, Knoblauch simply stopped playing. He turned to the first base umpire and started arguing a runner interference call, while the baseball was still live on the field, rolling unattended, nobody touching it. Cleveland's Enrique Wilson, who had been standing on first base, looked at the ball, looked at the fielders who had stopped to watch Knoblauch argue, and kept running. He scored from first base on a bunt play, while the Yankees' second baseman was focused on a dispute with an umpire. It cost the Yankees the go-ahead run. It was strange and costly and completely out of character for a player who had earned his reputation by never making mental mistakes. Nobody called it a warning sign at the time, but in hindsight, it absolutely was. The errors came next, and they came in numbers that were impossible to explain away. In 7 seasons in Minnesota, playing in over 1,000 games at second base, Knoblauch had made 66 total errors. That works out to a shade under 10 per season, which, for an active, aggressive infielder, is a perfectly respectable and normal rate. In 1998, his first year with New York, he made 13. A little high, not alarming. In 1999, the number jumped to 26. And here's the detail that makes that number so deeply troubling. Every single one of those 26 errors was a throwing error, not a misread ball off the bat, not a bobbled grounder, not a footwork problem on a difficult pivot. Throws, the most basic and automatic action in a second baseman's repertoire. The thing you do without thinking because you have done it so many thousands of times that your arm knows what to do before your brain has finished forming the thought. Something had gone wrong in the connection between his mind and his throwing arm, and the stat sheet was documenting the collapse with cold precision. By 2000, the situation had moved well past concerning and into genuinely alarming territory. In just 82 games at second base, less than half a full season, Knoblauch made 15 errors. 10 of them were throwing errors. He was making throwing mistakes at nearly 3 times the per-game rate he had maintained over his entire career in Minnesota. In baseball terms, what was happening to him had a specific name, a name that any player who hears it applied to themselves feels in the pit of their stomach: the yips. The term dates back to the 1920s when a golfer named Tommy Armour used it to describe the sudden and inexplicable loss of fine motor control that was ruining his short game on the putting green. In baseball, the condition had shown up before. Steve Sax, who also played second base, went through it in the 1980s. Catcher Mackie Sasser lost the ability to return the ball cleanly to the pitcher, a throw of roughly 60 feet that he had made thousands of times. But neither Sax nor Sasser went through it in New York, at the center of a dynastic championship team, with the full weight of the tabloid media documenting each error in real time. What was coming for Knoblauch was going to be uniquely and devastatingly public. To understand why the yips take hold of an athlete the way they do, you have to understand a basic truth about how skilled movement works inside the human body. Motor skills that are practiced thousands of times become automatic. They are removed from conscious control and handled by deeper neural pathways that operate without deliberate thought. A second baseman does not think about his arm angle when he fields a grounder and fires to first. He just does it. It is as automatic as walking. But when extreme emotional stress enters the picture, something breaks down in that automatic process. The conscious brain, overwhelmed by anxiety and the fear of failure, starts trying to insert itself into movements it was never designed to manage. You start thinking about the throw. You start monitoring your elbow, your wrist, your step. You start asking where the ball is going before you have released it. And the moment that conscious monitoring begins, the automatic process falls apart. The fear of making an error increases the likelihood of making one, which creates more fear, which creates worse throws, which creates more fear. It is a self-feeding loop, and once it locks in, it is one of the most difficult things in sports psychology to break. For Knoblauch, this loop did not form in isolation or in a vacuum. It formed inside a set of personal circumstances that were each, on their own, serious enough to affect anyone's performance and state of mind, and they were all happening at the same time. In 1999, the exact year his errors doubled to 26, Knoblauch was going through a divorce from his first wife, Lisa. Divorce carries its own particular form of sustained emotional damage. It disrupts your sense of stability at home, it affects your sleep, it intrudes on your focus during working hours, and for a professional athlete whose entire identity is bound up in performance and control, it removes the one place you used to be able to fully relax. But the divorce was not even the heaviest thing he was carrying. At the same time, his father, Ray Knoblauch, was battling advanced Alzheimer's disease. There are very few experiences in adult life that carry the particular weight of watching a parent disappear inside that illness. The father who presumably taught him to play baseball, who watched him develop through youth leagues and the minors and into the major leagues, who saw him win the Rookie of the Year award and a World Series ring in the same season, was slipping away, piece by piece, day by day. And no matter how famous his son was, no matter how many championships he was winning in New York, there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. Layered on top of all of that was the environment itself. New York is not a city that gives struggling athletes space and privacy to work through their problems. The media coverage was relentless, fan expectations were enormous, and back in Minnesota, a city that once loved him was now treating him as a villain whenever he returned. There was no safe place. There was no quiet corner where he could field ground balls and work on his mechanics without it being watched, analyzed, and written about. The anxiety loop that sports psychologists describe so clinically was not an abstract concept in Chuck Knoblauch's life in 1999 and 2000. It was the texture of his daily existence. And then came June 2000, the month when everything that had been building privately went fully and catastrophically public. On June 15, 2000, the New York Yankees were at home against the Chicago White Sox. Knoblauch was at his usual position at second base. Through the first 6 innings of what would become a 12-3 loss, he committed 3 separate throwing errors, 3 in 6 innings, each one more visible and more damaging than the last. After the third error prolonged a White Sox inning and pushed the deficit to a point of no return, manager Joe Torre walked out to the mound to change pitchers. The entire Yankees infield moved in toward the mound the way infields do during a pitching change. All of them except one. Knoblauch did not move toward the mound. He stood by himself out on the edge of the right field grass, completely apart from his teammates, hands on his hips, head slightly lowered, visibly unraveling in front of a full stadium and a national broadcast audience. It was one of the most striking and uncomfortable images in baseball that entire season. A player standing alone while everyone else gathered together, isolated, distressed, completely unable to hide what was happening to him. When the inning ended, he descended the dugout steps and had a brief conversation with Torre. A few minutes later, he had changed into street clothes and was gone from the building entirely, not moved to the bench to watch the rest of the game, not sent to the training room, gone from Yankee Stadium while his team was still playing a Major League Baseball game with innings left to play. Torre spoke to reporters afterward and handled the situation with notable grace, explaining that Knoblauch felt genuinely distressed about the fact that his struggles were actively hurting his team. Derek Jeter spoke up for him publicly too, saying the Yankees' path to winning ran directly through Knoblauch and that what he brought overall still outweighed what the errors were costing them. Those were loyal and decent things to say, but everyone watching television that evening knew the truth, regardless of what the teammates said. This was not a slump that a batting coach could address with cage work. This was a man who had fundamentally lost the ability to trust his own arm on a baseball field. That is not a mechanical problem. That is something much deeper. 2 days later, on June 17, 2000, Knoblauch returned to the starting lineup. The fans in the seats near the first base dugout were already nervous before the first pitch. They knew what could come off his arm, and then it came. On a completely routine ground ball hit by Greg Norton of the White Sox, Knoblauch fielded the ball cleanly, set his feet, and threw. The ball sailed wide and high. It flew over the first baseman, bounced off the roof of the Yankees dugout, and struck a woman in the stands directly in the face, breaking her glasses and sending a jolt of horror through everyone who saw it. The woman's name was Eve Olbermann. She was the mother of prominent television sports broadcaster Keith Olbermann. At the exact moment that ball struck his mother in the face, Keith Olbermann was hundreds of miles away in a studio in Los Angeles, hosting the Game of the Week broadcast for Fox. He was monitoring multiple television feeds from the ballpark. He saw the ball go into the stands near the dugout. He recognized the specific camera angles in the section of seats. He turned to his production crew and said quietly that he thought the ball had just hit his mother. The crew took it as a dark joke at first. Then the cameras found Eve Olbermann being carefully helped from her seat and escorted by stadium staff toward the first aid station. Olbermann maintained his composure on air. He delivered his segment, noted with dry understatement that Knoblauch's throwing problems had now become somewhat more personal for him, and reassured the viewing audience that his mother was going to be okay and would be returning to her seat. The story spread everywhere within hours. For 3 straight days, Eve Olbermann was on the front cover of the New York Post, the New York Daily News, and Newsday. The story ran in newspapers across the country. A professional baseball player's uncontrolled throw had sailed into the stands and struck an innocent spectator in the face, and that spectator happened to be the mother of one of the most recognized voices in American sports broadcasting. The New York tabloids had everything they needed. The coverage was complete and merciless. Chuck Knoblauch was no longer just a player struggling through a rough patch. He was now a potential danger to anyone sitting in the vicinity of first base. The Yankees moved him to the designated hitter role immediately to remove him from the field entirely. By the 2001 season, he had been transitioned permanently to left field, a position that required shorter, less precise throws that were less likely to injure someone. He never reclaimed his identity as a second baseman. He retired from professional baseball in 2003, and his career as an infielder was effectively finished long before that. Now, while all of that was unfolding publicly on the field and filling the back pages of every New York newspaper, another chapter was being written in a quieter place. It would not become public for several more years, but when it did, it added yet another coat of damage to a legacy that was already deeply complicated. In December 2000, 2007, the Mitchell Report was released. It was the most comprehensive independent investigation into the use of performance-enhancing drugs in Major League Baseball ever conducted, and the names it contained included some of the biggest in the game. Chuck Knoblauch was in it. According to testimony from performance trainer Brian McNamee, he had purchased human growth hormone from a supplier named Kirk Radomski and injected Knoblauch between 7 and 9 times during the 2001 season. That was the season Knoblauch had been relocated to the outfield, the season in which he was trying desperately to find some way to stay useful to a championship team while his most natural skill set was gone. McNamee's account was corroborated by a separate source, a 2007 unsealed affidavit from former pitcher Jason Grimsley, who also named Knoblauch as an HGH user, 2 independent sources pointing at the same person and the same substance. When congressional investigators began looking for Knoblauch's cooperation, he did not initially respond to their requests. He was subpoenaed in early 2008. The subpoena was later withdrawn after he agreed to provide an official deposition, and in that deposition, he admitted to using human growth hormone and made a statement that, depending on your perspective, was either remarkably candid or profoundly sad. He said, "I did HGH. It did not help me out. It did not make me any better. So there was no good that came out of it for me." There is something genuinely difficult about sitting with those words. A player who had been nicknamed fundamentally sound, who had built his entire identity around doing things correctly and reliably, who had earned 4 All-Star selections and a Gold Glove by being someone that coaches and managers and teammates could count on absolutely, had ended up injecting a banned substance into his body in a desperate attempt to hold on to something that was already gone. And it did not even work. He said so himself. His admission did not generate the same level of outrage that surrounded some of the other names in the Mitchell Report, perhaps because he was a diminished figure by then, and perhaps because his career was already over. But the substance of what he admitted to is unchanged regardless of the volume of the reaction. He used a banned performance-enhancing drug during an active Major League Baseball season. The Mitchell Report named him. That is part of the permanent record. When he finally retired in 2003, Knoblauch was 35 years old, and he had accumulated more public humiliation in a shorter span of time than most professional athletes ever experience across an entire career. The trade demand had transformed his hometown from a place that celebrated him into a place where fans threw objects at him during games. The yips had transformed his New York career from a dynasty story into a breakdown story. The walkout, the Eve Olbermann incident, the position change, the early retirement, and then the Mitchell Report had layered damage upon damage upon damage. Most observers figured the story was finished at that point, that he would find his way to a quiet private life somewhere and that would be the end of it. It was not the end. On September 25th, 2009, Houston police responded to a call from a resident in the city. Knoblauch's common-law wife, Stacy Stelmach, reported that he had physically assaulted and choked her. When officers arrived at the scene, they documented visible swelling near her eye and visible redness around her neck, consistent with the account she had provided. Prosecutors alleged that the incident had taken place during a period involving heavy drinking and the misuse of the prescription medication Xanax. Knoblauch was initially charged with a third-degree felony for choking a family member. On March the 16th, 2010, while going through a divorce from Stacy, the charge was pleaded down to a misdemeanor assault. He received probation and a fine. The story was reported but did not generate the kind of sustained national coverage that the baseball incidents had. It was documented quietly and it sat on the record. 4 years later, on July 24th, 2014, he was arrested again. His ex-wife Sherry alleged that Knoblauch had grabbed her and slammed her head into a wall and had thrown a humidifier at her during the confrontation. 2 arrests, 2 different women, 2 separate documented accounts of domestic violence separated by several years. The pattern was there for anyone looking at the record, and it was this second arrest in the summer of 2014 that triggered the final and most permanent act of institutional rejection. The Minnesota Twins had already voted for his Hall of Fame induction. The date had been set. The ceremony was organized. It was going to be a formal acknowledgement of what he had contributed to the franchise before everything went wrong. The 1991 championship, the stolen base record, the years of All-Star baseball. The organization had been willing to separate the player from the later history and honor the genuine achievements. But after the 2014 domestic violence arrest, the Twins did not deliberate for long. They canceled the induction. They issued a statement that distanced the franchise from him entirely. The door that had cracked open just enough to let in a moment of reconciliation was slammed shut permanently. His place in the franchise's formal history was erased before it could be inscribed. And that was the final word. Now we are back where we started this video, the Hall of Fame induction that was planned, scheduled, and then canceled in the span of a few weeks. And you now know the full story of of why. It is worth holding the complete picture together for a moment, because the story of Chuck Knoblauch does not reduce cleanly to a single theme or a single lesson. It is a story about how multiple things can go wrong simultaneously, and how the damage from each one feeds directly into the next. The pressure of playing in New York, the most demanding and most scrutinized baseball environment on earth, amplified and worsened the stress that his personal life was already generating. The stress from the divorce and from watching his father's illness had disrupted the neural pathways behind the most automatic skill in his defensive game. The public collapse of that skill humiliated him in front of the entire country over a period of years. The humiliation almost certainly deepened the anxiety. The anxiety led to reaching for something, a banned substance that he admitted did not even help, in a desperate attempt to salvage what remained of his athleticism. And somewhere in the years that followed the end of his baseball life, the instability and the unresolved personal damage that had first appeared on the field at Yankee Stadium showed up again in private, in the form of violence against two women who had been in relationships with him. The yips themselves were not his fault. That needs to be said plainly, and it needs to be said without qualification. Nobody chooses to lose the ability to perform a motor skill they have executed perfectly thousands of times. The brain breaks down under extreme sustained pressure, and it does so in ways that are well documented in sports psychology. Steve Sachs experienced it before him. Mackie Sasser experienced it. Other athletes across other sports have experienced their own versions of it. The condition is real, it is recognized, and it is genuinely painful to watch it happen to someone who was previously so excellent and so reliable. That aspect of Knoblauch's story deserves a fair degree of human sympathy. He was not weak. He was not lazy. He was overwhelmed by a convergence of pressures that would have tested anyone. But the remainder of his story does not dissolve simply because one part of it was genuinely beyond his control. He made the choice to publicly demand a trade from Minnesota without handling the situation with more care, and the damage to that relationship was lasting and real. He made the choice to use a banned substance during a professional baseball season, and the fact that it did not help him does not retroactively make it acceptable or remove it from the record. And the violence documented in 2009 and 2014 against two separate women in domestic settings is not something that can be explained away by pointing to the tragedy of the yips or the grief of watching his father lose himself to Alzheimer's. Those are decisions. Those are actions with real victims and real consequences. The women involved deserve to be part of this story just as clearly as the Gold Glove and the World Series rings. The Minnesota Twins Hall of Fame was supposed to be a clean ending to a story that had never been clean, a way to close the chapter on the player, to acknowledge genuine greatness without pretending the rest did not happen. That kind of separation between the player and the person is something baseball has managed before with complicated figures. But the 2014 arrest made that impossible, and the Twins organization made the decision to choose accountability over sentimentality. That decision communicates something about where the line is. What the complete story of Chuck Knoblauch leaves us with in the end is a set of uncomfortable but important truths. Elite athletic performance is far more fragile than it appears from the outside. The greatest players in the world are working within systems, physical systems and psychological systems that operate on extremely narrow tolerances. When the personal life begins to fracture, those tolerances disappear. Help matters enormously. The kind of help that gets at what is actually breaking rather than the symptom that shows up on the stat sheet. The kind of psychological and emotional support that baseball in 2000 was not remotely as equipped to provide as the sport is today. That context genuinely matters. It does not excuse what came later, but it matters. Chuck Knoblauch was once among the very best second basemen alive. That was absolutely true. The 1991 World Series ring was real. The Gold Glove was real. The 4 All-Star appearances were real. The stolen base records were real. The man who stood entirely alone on the right field grass at Yankee Stadium in June of 2000, hands on his hips, watching his career come undone in front of a full house and a national broadcast, was also real. So was the man who was arrested twice. So were the women whose accounts sit in official police documentation. So was the Hall of Fame ceremony that was announced and then canceled before it could happen. Every part of this story is real. You cannot keep the version you want and discard the rest. It all counts. It all happened. And taken together, it makes for one of the most complete and most sobering case studies that professional sports has ever produced. That is the full tragic truth about Chuck Knoblauch. If you made it all the way to the end of this story, drop a comment below with your thoughts on it. Do you feel sympathy for him? Do you think the Twins made the right call in canceling the induction? Do you think baseball failed him? Or did he fail baseball? Or was it some version of both at the same time? We want to hear what you think. And if you are not already subscribed to this channel, right now is a very good time to take care of that. Because we tell these stories the way they deserve to be told. The complete picture, no shortcuts, no comfortable myths, just the truth.